Maseches Nedarim Daf Yud Aleph, we begin with the Mishnah at the bottom of Daf Yud, which introduces the concept of hatfasa, which is another manner in which somebody can make a neder. Specifically, we'll focus on one that forbids items on himself. And the way to make the neder through hatfasa is to link it, to call it, and to say that it is like something else which is aser, or to say that it is not something which is mutter. So the Mishnah is going to discuss three categories of hatfasa. First is where you say that it's not something mutter. The second is where you say that it is something which is aser. And the third is where you say that it's like something which is a carbon. This is something which has an iser on it, but it itself is not iser. So let's see the three categories. So first, the Mishnah says somebody who says lachulin, which is a way of saying loy chulin, sha'ochalcha, that which I eat for you, or he says loy kosher, it's not kosher, or he says loy dachi or lo tahar. Our Mishnah's gersa is tahar, but the Rishonim have the gersa lo tahar, so he's saying that it's not tahar. The Aramaic term dachi is the same as tahar. So he's implying all these things are not good, they're not kosher. So what does he mean to say with that? He means to say that it is not all these items which are okay, and therefore he's clearly saying that they are aser. Those are all a valid form of making a neder to aser something upon himself. Now, he can also refer to a number of isurim which exist. And here he doesn't have to say like the iser, he just has to say the iser applies to it. So he could say tameh, noser, pigol. All those things are isurim. Those are isurim that apply to karbanos. A carbon tameh is aser, it's an iser kares. If it's left over, that's noser, that's an iser kares. If it's pigol, was made with the wrong intentions, it's an iser kares, and that's a way of creating a neder on an object. Now, the third category of making a neder through hatfasa is if he says it is like an object which itself is iser. Here he has to say like. You can't just say the name of the object. So if he says it's like sheep, that's referring to sheep that are brought for a carbon. If it's like dirim, that's referring to the enclosures in which those animals are kept, again referring to the animals that are brought for a carbon. If he says it's like wood, so then it's referring to the wood of the mizbeach. If he says it's like the fire, again of the mizbeach, like the mizbeach, like the heichel, that refers to the room in the Beis Hamikdash where you'll find ketores. Like Yerushalayim refers to karbanos in Yerushalayim. If he says it's like any of the kelim of the mizbeach, again, even though it doesn't mention carbon, it is also a way of saying that it is aser like those things. Now, the Mishnah ends off by saying that Rabbi Yehuda explains that if he says Yerushalayim and not Ki Yerushalayim, he doesn't say anything. That's not a valid term for making a neder. The Gemara explains that this is really one halacha. You have to say Ki, and you can't just say Yerushalayim. The Rishonim explain the reason why in all these things where he just says a thing like a sheep or a wood or an enclosure, that we assume that he's referring to the ones which are hektish, is because it's a suffix what he means, but we have to go l'chomer, we have to assume he means to make the neder. Now the Gemara wants to know who is the author of this Mishnah. The Gemara is going to ask that question in light of a machlokes between Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda about the concept of machlal lav ata shomei hein. Somebody says not something, that this is not something, does he mean that this is not something, but it is something else? Can you assume from what he says it's not, can you figure out what it is? So that's a machlokes between Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda in the concept of making a tanai. According to Rabbi Meir, every tanai has to be what we call a tanai of b'nei Gad or b'nei Ruvain, which means you have to spell out all the details of the tanai. If I do this, then this, and if I don't do this, then that. You can't just say one side and we'll figure out, well, if you do this, so then X, so therefore if you don't do it, obviously not X. Now you can't make those, you can't leave those conclusions to be made on their own. You have to spell out both sides. So Rabbi Meir clearly holds, we don't say Mechlal Havata Shemehin. You could figure out from what it's not, what it actually is. So therefore, this Mishnah, which starts off and it says Loi Chulin, that saying that something is not chulin is a valid way of saying it is a carbon, and that's a valid way of making it into a neder, of asering it like a carbon. He clearly can't be Rabbi Meir because the Mishnah clearly holds the fact that he says like chulin. We do understand that it is hektish. So this Mishnah is not Rabbi Meir. The problem is it can't be Rabbi Yehuda, even though Rabbi Yehuda holds you don't have to say the two sides of the Tanai, and he holds Mechalav you do hear Hain. If you say something if you say what it's not, I do automatically understand what it is. The problem is that Rabbi Yehuda is quoted in the end of the Mishnah, so the rest of the Mishnah can't be Rabbi Yehuda. So the Gemara explains the entire Mishnah as Rabbi Yehuda, and the end it's really all Rabbi Yehuda speaking. In the end, just explains that Rabbi Yehuda holds that the reason that the Mishnah is set up this way, and the reason the Mishnah says this halacha is because Rabbi Yehuda holds if you just say Yerushalayim, you didn't say anything, you have to say Ki Yerushalayim. But it's really all Rabbi Yehuda all along. So now the Gemara asks is a contradiction. If Rabbi Yehuda is the author of this brisa, here he holds that if you say Ki Yerushalayim, that is a valid neder. But we have a brisa where if he says Ki Yerushalayim, it's not a neder. You have to specifically refer to something which is karev, something which goes in the mizbeach. The says, okay, it's a machlokas tanaim within Rabbi Yehuda whether saying Ki Yerushalayim works or not. This Tana holds Ki Yerushalayim works. The Gemara brings another brisa, and again, the Gemaras are going to have trouble figuring out who the author of the brisa is, and this machlokas Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda. This time, no names are quoted, but it's going to involve another dispute, and it'll seem to go one way in the issue of Mechalav Atashemei Hain, and go the other way in the other dispute. So this Mishnah has three cases. The Rishonim take out the middle case. So the first case is where someone says Chulin, HaChulin, or Kichulin. So he says Chulin, the Chulin, or like Chulin, and he says that in two sub cases. He says, first of all, he could say that's referring to the food that I eat. So if he says that, the food of yours that I eat, if he says that, of course, there's no problem. He's saying the food of yours that I eat is chulin. Okay, there's nothing wrong with that. He's saying everything is great. If he says it's chulin, that of yours which I don't eat, then there's an implication that that of yours which I do eat is a carbon. It's not chulin, it's a carbon. That would be creating a neder on the carbon if we held that you can make such derivations of Mechalav Atashemei Hain. This Mishnah Paskins, it is not a valid neder, it's mutter, and therefore it has to be Rabbi Meir who does not hold Mechalav Atashemei Hain. That's why if he says Chulin, Achulin, Kechulin, what that of yours which I don't eat, it does not make a neder on that of yours which I do eat. Now, the second case in the Mishnah is where he says Lachulin Sha'ochalacha, that which of yours which I do eat is not chulin. That creates an iser. This is again an example of Mechalav Atashemei Hain, and the Gemara therefore, the Rishonim therefore delete this because this can't be Rabbi Meir. This has to be Rabbi Yehuda, so we take that out. Now the third case is a bit more complex, and that's where he says. Lachulin lo ochelacha. So the Gemara in its initial understanding understands that means it's not chulin, that which I'm not eating from you. Now, that would imply that it is chulin, that which I am eating from you. And the Mishnah rules this is not a neder, everything's mutter. Now, if we understand it on the face value, when he says it's not chulin what I'm not eating, and it is chulin what I am eating, so there's no problem. Everything's fine. What he's eating is fine. The problem is that Rabbi Meir, in a Mishnah coming up in Daf Gimel, does not understand his intention here. And Rabbi Meir, he does not understand his intention this way in a similar Mishnah. And Rabbi Meir gives a ruling which should be usher here. And therefore, this can't be Rabbi Meir. The case over there is where he says, la carbon, what I'm not eating from you. And Rav Meir says that is usser, creates an isser. So the problem is, if he's saying that it's la carbon, what I'm not eating from you, and then he's saying it's not a carbon what I'm not eating, and the implication is, but it is a carbon what I am eating, that creates an isser only if you hold Mechalav Atashemei Hain, but Rabbi Meir doesn't hold that way. So we had trouble with that Mishnah, and therefore we had to say that Rabbi Meir is reading this Mishnah differently. He's understanding it as an explanation. He's saying Le carbon yehei. He's saying that it is a carbon. When he says la carbon, he's saying it is a carbon. Therefore, lo ochelcha. I'm not going to eat from it. And this is not any implications involved. This is spelling out clearly that it is a carbon. Therefore, I'm not going to eat it. And that's why Rav Meir there rules that it's usher. Now, this is a very similar type of structure, except it says la chulin lo ochelcha instead of la carbon lo ochelcha. And therefore, we should understand from him that what this Mishnah means to say is loy chulin, it's not chulin, therefore I'm not going to eat it from you, with no implications involved, and therefore it's a perfectly normal way of saying the neder, and Rabbi Meir should therefore rule that this is usher, and it creates a valid neder, according to the way of understanding it. But Rabbi Meir, this brisa doesn't say that it's a valid neder. He says that it's not a valid neder, so therefore this can't be Rabbi Meir. So that's a problem. The first case has to be Rabbi Meir because it does not hold of implications. The last case can't be Rabbi Meir because it does not read it as a therefore type of sentence. It just reads it as a straight up lachulin. It's not chulin what I'm not going to eat from you. So the Gemara gives two answers. The Gemara's first answer is that this brisa just argues on Rabbi Meir over there. There's two different Tanaim, and that Mishnah has one version of Rabbi Meir, understands Rabbi Meir that this type of phraseology is a therefore phrase, and our Mishnah doesn't understand it that way. Our Mishnah understands it as a simple, it's not chulin, that which I'm not going to eat from you, and that's not a problem at all of being an neder, and that's okay. Rav Ashi says that actually you could fit the two together, the Mishnah and the Brisa, and you actually have to pronounce the word differently. Our Mishnah is meant to be read as lachulin, and therefore it's saying that it's not chulin, that which I'll eat from you. The one there is saying li carbon with a shva, and therefore he's saying that it is a carbon, and that's why Rabbi Meir reads it differently there and has a different implication there than he has here. The Gemara now begins a new sugya with a question. We said that somebody can answer something by saying that it's tamei, noisur, or pigul. So the Gemara has a question asked by Rami Bar Chama. What if somebody says that this meat should be to me like the meat of a carbon shlamim after the blood has been sprinkled? So the Gemara says what the meat of carbon shlamim after the blood has been sprinkled is mutter. So he's saying that it's like something which is mutter. What's the problem? So we're saying no, that's not the question. The question is where he had two pieces of meat in front of him. One is regular chulin, and one is a meat of carbon shlamim after it's been sprinkled. And then he says these two are the same. So the question is, what does he mean? He means to say that they're the same and therefore they're both mutter, or he means to say that the chulin meat should be like the carbon shlamim, but he's referring to the time before the carbon shlamim was mutter, at the time when it was hektish and it was aser. So Gemara is going to try to resolve the question, and that'll be discussed on the next daf.